The Second World War has gone down in history as the greatest show of military power the world has ever known.
Niemals erlahmen und niemals ermüden.
Since it ended over 70 years ago, historians have pored over every detail of the battle to understand what set it in motion, what kept it going, and the full truth of its legacy.
The events may not change, but how we see them does. In this film, I'll be looking at the way we've reinterpreted the war since it ended. And in particular, I'll be investigating the role documentary television has played in unraveling the story of World War II.
Historical documentary has played a key role. Whether breaking new discoveries or re-examining famous events.
30 years, BBC's Timewatch has examined just about every aspect of World War II, bringing the most important and controversial events and analysis into our homes and minds.
I'll be using Timewatch and 50 years of BBC archive to show how our understanding of the darkest hours and greatest victories change over time. This is a complicated history, a story about morality and ethics in the most devastating war the world has ever seen.
On September the 3rd, 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany and set in motion some of the most difficult and turbulent years in our island's history. But they also created the iconic moments that have come to define our nation and the spirit of our people.
No other story looms larger than the Battle of Britain, when the seemingly undermanned RAF tackles the mighty German Luftwaffe and wins. The victory stops a Nazi invasion of our shores.
The Battle of Britain has become part of our folklore, one of our greatest stories. It not only showed the heroism of the RAF, but the determination of the British people as a whole, which is exactly what Timewatch discovered when it re-examined the story in 1998.
In the summer of 1940, German fighters flew into the skies above southern England, meeting the RAF head-on. This was air-to-air combat, but it would not stay that way for long. Hitler had his eye on additional targets that included London.
Frankly, I thought I would never come out alive. I don't know what other people felt. I felt that there's no way that I can survive this continual battering, night and day after day, night after night.
During the first raid on London, more than 300,000 kilos of explosives were dropped on the East End and the docks. More than 2,000 people died or were seriously injured. The attack was the prelude to 70 consecutive night raids on the British capital. The Nazis hoped that the raids would break Britain's will to continue the war. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The reports from London are horrific, an inferno beyond belief. Will England surrender? I believe so. More mass attacks are imminent."
In popular myth, the German air offensive is seen as the precursor to an invasion, codenamed Unternehmen Seelöwe, Operation Sea Lion.
It's an enormously strong instinct, is the protection of your patch, and you did feel that they were intruders in our patch, but you were absolutely convinced that your home islands were under threat from whatever, bombing or invasion or anything else, and it really was up to you to do something about it.
By mid-September, the RAF had forced Germany to scale back its air campaign. The Allies had won the Battle of Britain. On the face of it, Operation Sea Lion had been stopped.
But the programme also revealed an unknown part of the story, and one that would change our view of German intentions during the battle.
No one disputes that the Battle of Britain was crucial to the British war effort. But the Battle of Britain did not stop Hitler from invading, for the evidence suggests that his intentions were already elsewhere. Special research into the records of the German army conducted for Timewatch shows that between July and the middle of September 1940, the earliest possible date for an invasion of England, the Germans had removed or reallocated more than half of their divisions in the west to Germany and the east of the Reich to become part of the preparations for an attack on the Soviet Union in the following year. On the 31st of July 1940, Hitler ordered the commanders of the army and the navy to a conference at the Berghof. Hitler told the leaders of the army that he was extremely skeptical about the practicalities of an invasion given the strength of the British Navy. Hitler then outlined an astonishing alternative strategy. Britain was to be beaten in the east. He told his generals,
"England mainly puts her hopes in Russia. If Russia is crushed, England's last hopes will have gone. Then, Germany will be the master of Europe in the Balkans. The sooner that Russia is crushed, the better."
While some believe Hitler's turn to the east was the deciding factor that stopped Operation Sea Lion, others are not so convinced.
I think we need to be clear that the Battle of Britain was not simply a draw. The Germans were unable to achieve air superiority over southern England, and any prospect of mounting a quick, cheap invasion in the autumn of 1940 was impossible.
Hitler was an opportunist, and he was a gambler. As late as the middle of September 1940, there is evidence to suggest that Hitler, in the right circumstances, might have given the green light to Operation Sea Lion. Of course, it might have been a disaster. The Royal Navy might have come steaming down the North Sea and the English Channel and sunk the lot. But in fact, that's not a guaranteed outcome.
Victory in the Battle of Britain gave the British confidence that they would win the war. Up to that point, everything Germany had done had led to military success. This was a German military failure. It was a British military victory. And because it took place in the skies over England, it was a victory in which everybody could feel associated.
Examining the details of war can redefine history, but it can also throw up complex questions. Hitler's decision to bomb London, a target with a massive civilian population, caused an outcry. Surely this broke the rules of war. But as the balance swung in the Allies' favour, the same accusation would be made against Britain. In 1944 and 1945, the Allies bombed Germany's industrial heartland, annihilating cities like Essen, Hamburg, and Dresden. These attacks have remained contentious in Germany, where many see them as war crimes. But they're also controversial here in Britain.
In 1992, a memorial was erected to Sir Arthur Harris, the head of the RAF's Bomber Command. He was the man responsible for bombing German cities, targeting the infrastructure that underpinned the German war machine. Shortly after its unveiling, that memorial was vandalized, and ever since has become a symbol of controversy.
Spring 1943. Bomber Command in action over the Ruhr, the industrial hub of Nazi Germany.
Timewatch took on the debate in 1993, inviting members of Bomber Command to defend their actions to the men and women who bore the brunt of the raids.
Erika Dienel, you were in Dresden. You experienced the consequences of that firestorm. What is your most powerful sense of strategic bombing?
I detest it for anybody. It doesn't matter which nationality or which country. I think it's the lowest form how soldiers can kill women and children, especially in Dresden where the war was over. It was more or less finished in a couple of weeks. To get medals for this sort of thing, I can see no reason whatsoever. I really despise people like that who still have today the idea about bombing of civilian people. And that's no honor to any country.
Bob Nelson, you were in Bomber Command. You were bombing during the war. You've heard that very
Yes.
powerful statement. Where are you?
Well, I was a wireless operator in a Lancaster bomber during a tour of operations, and Dresden was just another raid as far as we were concerned. It took 10 hours, 20 minutes, a round trip. We don't think at the time that we are going to bomb civilians, although of course we know that, if they don't get out of the way, they're going to get into trouble. But on the other hand, we are, taking our time to look around and make sure that we don't get shot down.
Is there any sense in which it could legitimately be said there was something, effectively a war crime, committed in the process of the strategic bombing campaign? Let me start, if I may, on this with the Secretary of the Bomber Command Association. Does the notion of war crime ring any bells at all for you?
None at all. I feel that on a bombing mission, the aircraft I flew in was made by our civilians. The bombs we carried were made by our civilians. The bombs that we dropped on the German civilians made the 88mm guns, the FW-190s. So the civilian suddenly has a different connotation. I don't see it as I was dropping bombs on actual civilians. They are people who are making the arms to fight back.
Paul Binding, you were brought up as a child in Essen, in Germany, just after the war. You're now a novelist and a journalist. What does the notion of war crime in this context mean to you? Does it have any validity?
It has validity. I mean, it's a validity that one is imposed on memories that will never die. Words cannot quite convey the devastation of Essen, the lifelessness, the smell of Essen, the widespread suffering, which is what I grew up as a small child, was utterly bewildered by. And the word war crime, after all, is a word I wouldn't have used in my experiences of it. I was only a small child trying to make sense of it. It's a word I use now reluctantly because it suggests naming the guilty. But what was done was a crime. That is not to say that people who did it were criminals. Those are two different issues. But the bombing of a city, the destruction of life on that scale, yes, that's a crime. What else can be a crime than that?
Vice Marshal, on this, the bombing of civilians, of homes, of women, children, schools, hospitals, inevitable in the process of area bombing. Is it far away from a crime?
Of course it is. Let me just take one point here. Was it a crime for the Luftwaffe to carry out its fire blitz of London?
Yes, it was, and it did hang in Nuremberg. And you make monuments.
Hang on, let's
They were also for war crimes in Nuremberg.
Let's have it. Let the Air Vice Marshal continue. Hold on a second. I want to bring you back. Why do you so confidently say no, not a crime?
Because a crime, to be convicted of a crime, you must have had the intent to commit it. There was no intent on the part of anyone from the top leadership.
May I speak?
From the top leadership down to the poor chaps who actually drove the aircraft.
Let me just take a vivid example. When the bombing of Wuppertal took place, liquid phosphorus was dropped. Children, women ran into the river Wupper like torches to be put out by the waters. How can that possibly not be seen as a crime? Obviously, the infliction of a weapon like that is a deliberate policy, and deliberate and appalling suffering took place. I cannot find any word that is adequate but crime for that.
You look in Dresden.
The debate over Bomber Command will forever rage. But even in the days immediately following the war, the campaign was contentious.
From the Second World War itself, there were critical voices saying that this is immoral, we shouldn't be doing this, it's unchristian, and so on. And that was the view I think that many people had after the immediate end of the war, the evidence about Dresden and so on. But over the course of the last 70 years, that's become quite a complicated argument. I think there are many people who say that morality in war is relative.
This was a total war. It's what the Germans call a Weltanschauungen, a clash of philosophies of life. And when such profoundly important things are perceived to be at stake, virtually any action is perceived as legitimate.
What makes a soldier in a battle not a murderer is the concept of military necessity, that he is acting under orders. And the Nuremberg judgments qualified that by saying there are some things for which you cannot use that defence. You have to be in a position of saying, I take responsibility for this, simply because they are such appalling acts.
The most appalling of these acts is, without doubt, the Holocaust. Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews. Hitler's program of extermination is perhaps the most heinous act in history and is without question a war crime. It sets moreover a benchmark by which the morality of the Nazis, indeed all the combatants of the war, is judged. Hitler's final solution would claim the lives of an estimated 6 million Jews, displacing millions more. In 1995, Timewatch examined the legacy of the Holocaust, reflected in the families of those who survived.
When they got to Auschwitz, the men and the women were separated immediately. And my father was the one who was closest to his little sister. She was 14 at the time, and he was, I suppose, 19 or 20. And she was taken from him. And somebody believes that they saw her being taken to the gas chambers.
Much of my information comes from my mother. And she had said even before my father died that when they were lining you up to take you to the work camp, she sort of watched in the midst of this chaos and noticed that they were separating the spouses. So she took off her wedding ring and told my father to do the same and said, we don't know each other.
It was actually towards the end of the afternoon, and it was time for his barrack to be exterminated. When they arrived at the gas chamber, the end of the day whistle blew. So there ensued an argument between the guard who had marched them to the gas chamber and the guard who was running the gas chamber. Ultimately, the gas chamber guard won the argument. The barrack guard marched everybody back, expecting them to be killed in the morning instead. But that morning, early that morning, someone arrived from a factory from this Gerlitz work camp to Auschwitz to requisition workers, which was a common procedure. And his barrack, being next in line, was sent off to Gerlitz, where he remained until that camp was liberated.
It was the Russians who liberated them. Afterwards, my father was looking through the women's quarters in the camp where they were, hoping to still be able to find his little sister. And he didn't find her, but he met my mother, and he liked her. So he came back the next day, and they started to date, and that was that.
When we arrived in the United States, we had a railroad flat. And when I say railroad flat, it was literally over the railroad. It was, the subway was, I would say, ran about 10 feet below my bedroom window. It was a very small place. For the first couple of years, neither parent spoke English, and my father had no means of support.
It wasn't long before I noticed that my mother was particularly different. She had difficulty handling stress. Certainly, I, as a 6-year-old, could handle stress better than she could. One of the major manifestations of her stress disorder is that she hears voices, usually Nazi voices. For instance, we might be in the car driving along, and she might hear, or think she hears, Nazis in the next car, and ask me to figure it out because she didn't want to distract herself from driving.
My parents were very intent on creating as normal a life for us as they possibly could. Since we were living in Germany, I was born in Germany, they insisted on speaking to us in German, not teaching us Polish or Yiddish, because they were concerned that if we were to go into the supermarket, for example, and we'd start speaking in Polish, that people would start looking at us. They wanted us to blend in and be as normal as other German kids. Part of that being normal meant not telling us about what happened to them. As a result, I didn't really find out what happened to them, really mean consciously, until I was in my late teens, even later than that. And yet, I can't think of a time when I didn't know.
The way we perceive the Holocaust has quite clearly changed almost generation by generation, I think, since the Second World War. I think the first post-war generation, people didn't really want to talk about it or think about it. Europe wanted to forget the war, progress, move on.
Even in the State of Israel itself, the first real attention to Holocaust survivors didn't start to be paid until the early 1960s, with the Eichmann trial in particular. Prior to that, people were reluctant to talk about what had been an unspeakably traumatic event.
There was a break point, I think, very much in the late 60s, early 70s, associated in some cases with television programs about the Holocaust, which really alerted people, really for the first time, to the dimension of the crime. And that also encouraged, I think, historians to reach out and begin to explore the Holocaust in a more sophisticated, analytical way.
This analysis has often centered on the Nazi regime, and, more specifically, its leader.
Since the war, countless documentaries and films have tried to work out what made Adolf Hitler tick, what triggered him to commit such appalling atrocities, and why the German people followed him, regardless of his deeply misguided agenda.
In 2005, Timewatch examined the psychological motives of Hitler. The film based its investigation on a psychological profile produced at the height of the war by Harvard psychoanalyst Walter Langer. Over 60 years after it was written, it was still clear that the state of Hitler's mind held clues to his actions.
This was the public face of Adolf Hitler. He'd risen to power in the 1920s, when the country was on the verge of economic and social collapse. He pledged to revitalize and rebuild Germany, and this was a message that the German people were desperate to hear.
It's really very important to understand Hitler, the Messiah, Hitler, the Savior. Indeed, he relished when people say, Heil Hitler, the Savior of the German people. And he identified, in fact, with Christ. If you take this notion of the empty self, which has built up this compensatory, grandiose, messianic facade, what happens when that facade is shattered?
In the final months of the conflict, Hitler made it known that total destruction was the Allies' only option if he was to be defeated.
In the last weeks of the war, Hitler issues his famous scorched earth directive, where the party and the military have to destroy everything. The Allies mustn't get anything. He doesn't mind now about the German people. The German people will starve. I mean, they've let him down. In this sense, Langer is right, that here is somebody who only really thinks in black and white, life and death. And Langer is spot on in this case. I mean, this is a suicidal personality. He's not somebody who's going to simply give up, lay down his arms and say, okay, let's have an armistice.
If his dream of total glory, of total power, were to fail, and that facade of grandiosity was to shatter, underneath this, that empty self would emerge, and that was intolerable for Hitler, and he had to kill himself rather than be confronted by this total shame and total humiliation.
The big question, and the very frightening question, was how had this happened? With the rise in the 1930s of Hitler and indeed the rise of Mussolini and the cult of Stalin, we seem to have this strange idea of a man appearing who certainly behaves as if he's mad, but has this incredible influence.
But it's really bound up with a strong sense of resentment of what happened at the end of the First World War, fears about national identity and survival, and by the time of the Economic Great Depression, a strong sense that Germany is going to go under. And Hitler suddenly seemed then to be a kind of messiah figure. And that fear of the future of Germany is what drove people to support Hitler.
Hitler's single-minded ambition would lead him to power and to a bitter war with his enemies. But the battlefield can reveal a different story. When enemies meet, the outcome is sometimes surprising.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest military campaign of the Second World War. It's a story of hunter and hunted, of German U-boats stalking Allied convoys in the cold and treacherous waters of the Atlantic Ocean. And for both sides, the consequences of defeat were nearly always fatal. In 1973, the BBC revealed the story of when Otto Kretschmer, one of the most successful U-boat commanders of all time, met the renowned Royal Navy commander Donald MacIntyre face to face in the middle of the Atlantic.
I had some time to collect all my men on the conning tower and tell them that this was the end of our war career, and that there was some possibility of us to get into captivity. My second lieutenant took the Morse lamp, and I spelled out the signal in English to him. It was, "I am sinking, please pick up my men."
And the last to come over the side was obviously the captain in his brass-bound hat. He was greeted by one of my lieutenants, Peter Sturdy, whose eye immediately were caught by his Zeiss binoculars hanging around his neck. In fact, he told me that the U-boat captain tried to get them off and throw them away because he didn't want them to get into possession of the enemy. However, Peter Sturdy grabbed these and brought them up to me on the bridge, where I promptly grabbed them from him and made them my spoils of war.
And up there, they took the life jacket from me and a pistol, at pistol point, I must say. And then the binoculars, which I had no time to throw overboard, which I would have liked. And then I was taken down to the captain's cabin, when for the first time I saw his horseshoe sign on the everything.
The U-boat captain noticed that our crest, the ship's crest, was a horseshoe. And he said, "That was the crest of my U-boat also, isn't that strange?" But of course ours was the other way up, with the points downwards. "Ah," said my chief, "no wonder you have been captured. That's the way the luck runs out, we always say."
And there I got warm clothes and some rum to drink and everything, which they could do for me, really. And immediately afterwards, when some dry clothes on, I went to sleep in Donald MacIntyre's wonderful armchair he had in his cabin. When I woke up again, I saw him sitting on his desk and looking at me with his legs dangling in rubber boots, I remember. And I congratulated him on his success, but also telling him that it was good luck for him because I had no torpedo left. Otherwise, things would have been a bit different. And he said some polite things too to me, and so immediately it seemed to be that we could be good friends.
As soon as the U-boat crews were safely on board, the two destroyers headed back to rejoin the convoy, which we did about dawn.
I was allowed to sleep in the captain's bunk, which was much better, of course. But until we went to sleep, there was still some time, and I don't know who it was, got the idea to play at cards. and they looked for the fourth man, and that was myself. So I played bridge with the captains of the sunk ships and officers of the destroyers.
While this 1973 film shows how enemies could become friends, a film just 4 years later would reveal the greatest secret of the battle, and possibly the entire war.
What was the most secret place in Britain during the Second World War? Perhaps the underground cabinet room in Whitehall, or the Naval Chiefs of Staff map room, or what about the Royal Aircraft Establishment Farnborough? No, none of those. It was this unassuming brick country house in Buckinghamshire.
In 1977, this film would be one of the first to tell the story of how Britain intercepted and broke Germany's secret codes at Bletchley Park.
These huts sheltered what came to be known as the Ultra Secret, or Ultra for short. As soon as the Enigma messages were picked up, they were sent by motorbike dispatch rider to Bletchley Park, the nerve centre of Ultra. The end result of all that activity, these decoded messages, by the thousand every day. The thoughts and deeds of the operational command system of the entire German armed forces. Now, these messages were passed to the intelligence huts, and Hut 3 included among its personnel Peter Calver-Caressy, head of the Air Force section.
Now what we got was hundreds of pieces of paper like this, and each one of these is a separate message, and it's got letters in groups of 5, and it's in German. You come into a run of letters which are really or mostly there. And in fact, here you have a complete German word, meldet, and that'll be meldet sich, is to report. That's an S, meldet sich. S-O-F-O-R, L is obviously a mistake for S-O-F-O-R-T, so fort, immediately, everything always happens immediately in messages like this, and this is the important bit at the end. So-and-so, Lieutenant so-and-so, is to report where? F-O blank blank I-O. It's not really terribly difficult. It's Foggia. He's to go to Foggia.
Our story has been confined to events that happened more than 30 years ago. And although cipher machines have gone a long way since then, much of this subject is still secret. And so the contribution made by Ultra can only really be judged by people who themselves had to use the information at the time.
The release at the end of the 1970s of the British intelligence files, the so-called Ultra Secret, was tremendously important, and it was done deliberately. Before then, historians had always half knew, half assumed that both sides were breaking each other's codes. This is not exactly news, but it was never known how it was done.
But what was equally surprising is that the secret lasted so long. For 3 decades, virtually nothing was written or said about this work, and yet thousands of people participated in the work done at Bletchley Park or knew about it for some other reason.
Today, the men and women who worked at Bletchley Park are revered for their wartime contribution.
There are countless heroes in times of conflict, but out of the millions that fought in the Second World War, only a select few are remembered for their courage. Many stories have slipped from memory, and often for political reasons.
The Indian Army fought gallantly as part of the British Empire in the Second World War, making major contributions in Burma, North Africa, and Italy. But, as Timewatch discovered, history would forget their bravery, both in Britain and India.
The Victoria Cross is the highest award for valour in the British Army. No less than 28 were won by the Indian Army during the Second World War.
Without the Indian Army, the Japanese would have overrun India. They'd have linked up with the Germans in Iran, and the whole world would have come under the domination of the Axis alliance. You can't really believe that we could have won the war without the Indian Army.
2.5 million troops from India, Pakistan and the rest of the subcontinent formed the biggest volunteer army in the history of the world. It is an army that some Britons choose to ignore. But the stained glass at Sandhurst tells a different story. During World War II, Indian troops fought across 3 continents under the Union Jack. They were at Dunkirk, they fought at Monte Cassino. They fought to save British democracy, even though under British rule they were denied it themselves.
फिर तो दिल खराब होता है, जैसे वो पाकी बोलते हैं। उस टाइम में माइंड में ये बात आती है कि हम इतना कुछ किया, अपनी जान कुर्बान की, अपना जो अपनी लाइफ का सबसे अच्छा हिस्सा था वो इनके लिए दिया, और फिर अभी सलूक जो है वो ऐसा हो रहा है।
It wasn't just the British who forgot them. The fact that so many Indians volunteered to fight for the British Empire became an embarrassment after independence. The whole subject is still sensitive. The Indian government refused Timewatch permission to film interviews in their country. In India, it is the INA of Chandra Bose whose veterans are fated as independence heroes and receive a freedom fighter's pension. Those who fought for the British do not.
लगता तो ऐसे ही है कि ठीक नहीं है उनका भी। हमको तो और भी था ना, हमें इग्नोर किया, उनको पेंशन्स दे दी हैं, लेकिन वो बोलते हैं वो तो फ्री जो थे फ्रीडम फाइटर थे। ये पॉलिटिक्स है उनके।
We feel that we are also forgotten what we did during the World War II. The British have forgotten us, the Indian Army also forgotten us.
बच्चा यतीम हो गया। अब जब उनके दूसरों के पल्ले पड़े थे, उनकी नई चीज़ आ गई, पुरानी चीज़ को जैसे रद्दी टोकरे में अच्छा पुराना कोट हो जाता है ना, नया फैशन आ जाता है, तो वो पुराने को फेंक दो, नया फैशन अडॉप्ट करो, वो चीज़ चल रही है।
While this film highlights the story of Indian volunteers, there are many more soldiers that have been overlooked.
It's a very curious fact, I think, that from 1945 onwards, the British public always thought of themselves as alone in the war. It's the one word you always hear about 1940, 41, Britain alone. Britain is not alone, wasn't alone. It was supported by a huge empire, the world's largest empire.
The Commonwealth nations mobilised something like 5 million men and women. The Indian Army of the Second World War is the largest all-volunteer army there's ever been in human history, 2.5 million service personnel. Other countries, of course, including, for example, the East African and the West African colonies, South Africa too, also made an immense contribution to the Commonwealth effort in the Second World War. And about 170,000 of these people died, and that's a bill of sacrifice that should not be forgotten.
There's an aphorism of a famous 19th century historian that history is on each occasion what one generation finds interesting about another. And in 21st century multicultural Britain, there is going to be greater interest in soldiers from the Indian subcontinent in the Second World War, or soldiers from the West Indies and Caribbean, or soldiers from the Irish Republic, or the contribution of women in Britain to the Second World War.
To be lauded by history, your story must become widely known. But for some, keeping quiet was an essential part of their job. An estimated 13,000 people worked in Britain's Special Operations Executive during the war, in jobs that demanded complete secrecy.
Spies are often the unsung heroes of history. Whether carrying out sabotage missions or relaying secret information, their actions have often made the difference between failure and victory. As more information about the role of spies during the Second World War has been released to the public, their stories have captured the world's imagination.
Timewatch tracked down some of the intelligence operatives that had worked in France, taking them back to their old haunts to lift the lid on their secret stories. Tony Brooks was stationed in Lyon.
When you came in, you shook hands with half the bloody customers. Very much a solid working class place. And any talking shop would be very sort of covert. I might say, and we're hoping that about 5 friends, because we used to call them les amis, will turn up at the end of next week, which meant we're going to have 5 parachute drops next week or something like that, which would enter into the ordinary conversation.
The proprietor used the cash register to raise the alarm.
He didn't use it as a till. It meant that somebody had just come in the front door he didn't like the look of. Like a lot of these houses, old houses in Lyon, there are lots of exits, and you come out about 3 doors further down the street.
Unbeknownst to Tony, also in Lyon was his colleague in training, the radio operator Brian Stonehouse. He had found a chateau outside Lyon from which to transmit. Over half a century later, he returns. The owner's wife, Elsa Jourdain, had been a fashion model.
We had met, according to this cover story, in Paris before the war, in the fashion world. And I was drawing for Vogue magazine in Paris. Well, of course, none of it is true. But this was just a cover story.
His courier, Christian, brought in more and more messages to encode and transmit. The workload was getting dangerously heavy.
In Lyon, what happened was that some of the radio operators had been arrested before me, and all their stuff came to me, to send to London through me, and I did it, and that's when I was on the air for hours. I radioed London and told them that being on the air this long, I was committing suicide.
Inevitably, the radio detection vans pinned him down.
This is the room where I was transmitting. And I think a piece of the antenna was up there. I tried to pull it down and didn't take all of it. And then I hid the set in the bottom of the lift shaft, but I forgot a piece of antenna with the insulator at the end, and that was found. So I couldn't deny anymore that I'd had a set here, a transmitter. That's how it happened.
News of Brian's arrest came into Special Operations Executive in London, and a grim addition was made to his file.
I thought I'd be shot as a spy. And I wanted my family to be able to trace me after the war. That was the main reason for declaring myself British.
Brian's parents didn't learn he was missing until over a year after his arrest. By then he was on his way to the first of 5 Nazi concentration camps. On the day Dachau was liberated, he was photographed among the mass of prisoners, along with another agent, Bob Shepherd. A week later, both were back in England.
Bob and I were in full uniform, and sort of somewhere near the Albert Hall, I don't know why, and a funeral went past.
And we started laughing because we thought, you know, all that fuss for one corpse. And I think one used to laugh because that's one's only defense. You know, if you started crying, you know, it's sometimes I feel now, you know, if I start crying, I won't stop.
Spies were crucial to Allied victory. Their work underpinned every major operation, including our most famous, D-Day.
Certain stories capture the public imagination. They are narratives we become obsessed with. There have been, for example, literally hundreds of films made by the BBC about D-Day, and doubtless there'll be hundreds more.
The D-Day landings were an unprecedented success, the largest sea-to-land invasion ever mounted. But not everything went to plan. The American landings on Omaha Beach were a disaster. And, as Timewatch discovered in 2008, historians are still trying to figure out what went wrong. Their examination started with an assault on a gun battery, before the main landing on Omaha had even begun.
The Allied High Command believed that the mission here at the Pointe du Hoc was absolutely critical to the success of D-Day. If the guns at the Pointe du Hoc were still functioning, with their range, which was 23,000 metres from this position, there was a real danger that they might be able to shoot at, damage, sink Allied shipping out in the Bay of the Seine. So from the American point of view, First Army's success at Omaha Beach was integrally tied to the assault at the Pointe du Hoc.
We were fired on while coming in. This was not a surprise. The enemy had had about 30 minutes to get up out of his underground bunkers. He was up there throwing hand grenades down by the bushel basketful and firing right down on us, and there was rapid fire situations on either flank that were firing into us. So we had that to come into. The ropes were fired up. There were grapple hooks. Some of them pulled out. The enemy, damn it, cut some of the ropes. You say that was not kosher, you know. And there were two guys on a rope right in front of me going up. So I started in behind them, about 50 feet below them. And the enemy was leaning over up there throwing down grenades, and I yelled up to these fellows. I said, "Boys, put your faces in and your butts out. They're throwing grenades." The main force had to go in on Omaha Beach. And they were supposed to fight their way up to us by noon. And they got up there at noon on the third day.
As they land, they're in a natural killing ground. They're on beaches that are completely exposed to enemy fire. There is no cover. There's no trees, there's no trenches, there's no nothing. The troops are out there in the open.
Imagine the shock. In other words, you're told that you're going to see greatest firepower show on Earth. And then you hit the beach there, and everybody's alive. All the enemy forces are alert. Yeah, it's going to be a bloody day. It's going to be a bloody day. It was a bloody day.
The Americans had been given pre-landing support by air and sea, but it hadn't been successful, leaving the men defenseless. As Timewatch revealed, the scale of the slaughter took years to comprehend.
The casualty count on Omaha Beach, in retrospect, was much, much higher than historians had previously thought. Realistically, only in the last couple of years have historians been able to figure out that the count was probably twice as high as first thought. In the range of 4,500 to 5,000 men became casualties on Omaha in an 18-hour period. It was not in any way foreseen that the casualties would come with the intensity that they did in the first couple of hours of the invasion. From 6:30 in the morning to 9:30 in the morning on D-Day, American soldiers were being felled on the beach like stalks of wheat by a sickle.
Despite the carnage, the success of D-Day has raised the event to a near mythic status. But it's partly due to how the story's been told and how it's changed.
There was a time, especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, when D-Day was seen primarily as a function of the decisions of great commanders, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Rommel and people like this. And I think what's happened in the last few decades is a sense of understanding the broader experience of D-Day and the Normandy campaign, as seen through the eyes of thousands of ordinary servicemen and women who either participated in or supported that great endeavour.
I've had on a number of occasions, and it is very humbling, old veterans come up to me and say, I was 18 years old, can you tell me where I was and what I was doing? And taking them there, very often it will trigger a memory, and they will then start talking about the experience they've had, and for historians this is invaluable. It humanises the experience.
D-Day will forever be etched into our minds. It's a pivotal moment in the Second World War. But some stories are told for precisely the opposite reason, because they did not become important.
In the 1980s, Timewatch investigated recently declassified documents that showed how close we came to using chemical weapons during the Second World War. Nerve, mustard and chlorine gas were all readily available to both the Allies and the Axis powers. But they were never used, turning the story into one of the big what-if questions of the conflict.
In Timewatch this month, the terrible weapon of the Second World War that was never used, gas. You can pick up gas masks today in junk shops and second-hand stores from one end of the country to the other. They're probably the most prevalent of the surviving flotsam of the last war. Which isn't surprising, as the year before war broke out, millions were distributed, one for every man, woman, child and baby. Gas attacks were expected daily. The Ministry of Home Security posters on every street corner gave instructions on what exactly to do when the gas rattle sounded and an attack began. Hold your breath. Put on mask wherever you are. Close window. If out of doors, take off hat. Put on your mask. Turn up collar. Put on gloves or keep hands in pockets. Take cover in nearest building.
In the 1930s, poison gas occupied a place rather like the atom bomb occupies nowadays. This was science at its most advanced, waiting to be applied to the protection of the national security, the destruction of the human race, whichever way you look at it.
This factory has never been filmed before. It lies in the Welsh village of Rhydymowen, and during the last war it was codenamed Valley. Valley was one of Britain's 3 wartime mustard gas factories. The others were at St Helens and Runcorn. Valley was run by ICI, and at its peak was producing over 100 tons of mustard gas a week. The gas was stored in an underground arsenal tunnelled into a nearby hill, capable of holding 5,000 tons of chemicals. Valley began production in 1941. By the spring of 1942, Britain was employing 6,000 munitions workers and scientists who had produced over 20,000 tons of chemical weapons. It was here in the British War Cabinet offices beneath Whitehall in the summer of 1940 that the first serious consideration was given to the question of using chemical warfare. Here, for more than 2 weeks that summer, a fierce debate raged among Britain's military commanders about the wisdom of using gas to defeat a German invasion. The argument between gas's advocates and opponents was finally settled by the Prime Minister on the 30th of June 1940. One of the striking features of the papers which have been released is the light they shed on the extraordinary personal interest taken in chemical warfare by the Prime Minister Winston Churchill. These, for instance, are the monthly gas production figures of Britain's munition factories, and these had to be submitted regularly to the Prime Minister for his personal comment.
We could drench the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany in such a way that most of the population will be requiring constant medical attention. It may be several weeks or even months before I shall ask you to drench Germany with poison gas. And if we do it, Let us do it, 100%.
Germany, perhaps more than any other power, was impressed by the threat of retaliation because it had persuaded itself that it was weak in this area itself. And one has to remember that the Treaty of Versailles had placed strict limits on German chemical warfare preparedness, so that it could see itself 10, 15 years behind its enemies.
So there's an irony here, you're saying, that the one belligerent power upon which deterrence had an effect was actually Nazi Germany.
Because it believed itself to be so inferior, it had, as it were, persuaded itself into a situation of sensitivity towards this threat.
The Germans' overestimation of Allied superiority was probably the decisive factor in their decision not to use gas.
In the 1980s, documents revealed the hidden strategy as Churchill prepared for chemical war. 70 years after the war ended, it's tempting to think that we now know exactly what happened.
Given the vast documentary record of the Second World War and the amount of effort that's been expended on trying to understand it and turn it into books and television documentaries, it seems difficult to imagine that we don't know all that there is to know about the Second World War. But in fact, I think this is very far from being the case.
People often say to me when I say I'm going to write something else from the Second World War, not the Second World War again, what else can there be to say? And as a historian, of course, I always say, there will always be new things to say. You will always put things into a different relation. You'll always find different perspectives. You'll also find new material that's being uncovered all the time.
The final history of the war can never be written and never will be written. It's a constant process of re-examination as the present moves forward. The past is dead. It doesn't exist. What we have is evidence that exists in the present, and we call that evidence history.
Less than a century ago, a global war gripped our nation. For over 5 years, both at home and abroad, Britain gave her all in the fight against Nazi Germany.
Since it ended, World War II has been examined and re-examined. Stories have been discovered, and debates have raged. And still the narrative evolves, as new theories and fresh research reshape the events we thought we knew.
And it's all been captured on our screens, making us part of the debate, making us part of history. In the years ahead, there will be many more disagreements as we grapple with our past. But there will also be incredible discoveries of stories still untold, new facts coming to light, and long-forgotten heroes revealed to us for the first time. The Second World War may have ended over 70 years ago, but its history is still alive and constantly changing.
Coming up next tonight here on BBC4, what's in store for the human brains of the future? From life in a digital simulation to People 2.0, David Eagleman finds out in the final part of his brand new series in just a moment.